justice. We have experts tonight that will talk about these things. And so we want to make sure that you are engaged. So if you have ideas as you hear people speak, please share them. Thank you for introducing yourself, Sharon. Welcome, and welcome to everybody that is joining on chat. I'm going to look at chat in a moment as well. I also want to make sure that if you need closed captioning, that you can use the closed caption icon, and that also will enable you to use that feature for this evening's conversation. I also didn't want to begin the conversation without acknowledging all of the violence and anti-Asian hate that our AAPI community has been experiencing. Like Fannie Lou Hamer says, no one is free until everyone is free. And so want to just make sure that we're lifting that community up, and of course, centering folks who are experiencing harm every day. Without further ado, it's an honor to work with the controller and to now work for the controller. Brad Lander, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sadie Kempo-Amor. Please give it up for Sadie, for our moderator in the chat, for getting us all started. It is amazing to be in community with this extraordinary group of fierce women and feminist activists and gender equity activists. And it seems perfect to be doing this on the toward the very end of Women's History Month, with some women who are really making history every day. And with clarity that it's our responsibility to learn from what's come before us. Like, that's what we're doing with history, is trying to be attentive to it. And for those of us who hold a lot of privilege, that means confronting it honestly with as little defensiveness, as little hoarding of power as we can, and with real humility for the people who are rising up to demand justice. I'm humbled to be co-sponsoring this event with two remarkable co-hosts who you're going to hear from momentarily, from whom I have already learned so much, and with an equally amazing and powerful set of panelists. I had a feeling like this last week. I don't know if anyone else has had the good blessing of going to see Suffs, the amazing musical about the suffragist struggle at the Public Theater by Shana Tao, but I really urge people to go see it, because I think it has a lot of pretty useful lessons that we can't suppress the internal tensions and contradictions in our movement. Nikki James plays a brilliant Ida B. Wells, giving, what they didn't call 100 years ago an intersectional critique of the suffragist movement, but a powerful one nonetheless. Remembering that victory is possible against fierce odds, but also that the struggle goes on, that this is like a never-ending struggle, and that we got to find its blessings and joys engaging together. And that young people are at the vanguard of our movements. I didn't know that the young are at the gates was a sign that comes from the suffragist movement, not just like from climate activists, and a view of Women's History Month that demands our insistent activism is what we're about tonight. That's really the spirit of this event. The pandemic spotlighted pre-existing inequalities along lines of both gender and race, and then it exacerbated those inequalities. So it demands that we fight for a recovery that centers gender and racial equity. That's what a feminist recovery means. You'll be able to see that in the policy brief that our three offices are so excited to be releasing tomorrow and previewing for you tonight. It spotlights a whole set of those pre-existing inequalities. The fact that even before the pandemic, 1 in 5 women in New York City were living at or below poverty. And rates were closer to 1 in 3 among women caring for young children. In the immediate wake of the pandemic, as families grappled with lockdowns and remote schooling, nearly 220,000 New York City women dropped out of the labor force. And of course, as we know, then wound up doing a disproportionate share of the work at home, of the work as teachers, of the work as caregivers. Women's labor force participation has rebounded as of the end of last year. But those figures mask high unemployment rates, particularly among Black women. Over 50,000 more women are unemployed now than at the start of the pandemic, and nearly half of them are Black women. We have to look honestly at the pain that inequality causes. But in this report and tonight, we don't stop there. The report highlights 12 policy steps that we can take to a feminist recovery. And I really think 12 steps is appropriate, because when we say feminist recovery, we don't only mean from the pandemic, we mean that we must be in recovery from the condition of systemic sexism that has so deeply and rottenly shaped our society. And the first step in recovery is getting past denial. And that is never easy, but it is possible. In this wonderful book that some of you have probably read, The Sum of Us, Heather McGhee offers an analogy for the challenge of building a universal movement against racial oppression that I really think applies here too. She tells the story of how in Southern towns, when faced with the requirement to integrate, people essentially were willing to close down their swimming pools rather than share them. And she calls that drained pool politics, a kind of zero-sum world where people cling so hard to privilege that they throw away public goods rather than share them. But she also shows how foolish and limited that approach is, because it's obviously way better to have an integrated swimming pool than a segregated swimming pool, and definitely than no swimming pool at all. And the same is true and when we think about what New York City could be with a feminist recovery. Yes, in the world we're imagining, men, especially white men over 50 like me, will have a much less disproportionate share of power and wealth. But that doesn't have to be giving something up, because so much more is gained in return by living in a city where women are leading, where young people are more equally nourished, where the set of people developing climate technologies and businesses and culture and leading in politics fully reflect the diversity of this beautiful place we're lucky to share. And, how do I know this is true? Because it's not just my wife and my daughter, but also my son and I, who feel so immensely lucky to live in a world where Shahana Hanif and Tiffany Caban are our leaders, where this amazing set of activists are the ones doing the work that's creating future communities. I have had the great good fortune to learn so much from many of you, and from each of them, people who have pushed me past my comfort zone, especially on issues of public safety and criminal justice, and taught me what it looks like to show up as a leader, especially for the most marginalized folks in times of crisis, but always with a kind of compassion and joy that makes all that hard work worth it. So I feel really grateful to get to be a partner with them tonight, and even more excited to imagine living in the city transformed by the feminist and anti-racist principles that they are leading with. And I long to live in the city that really reflects the leadership of the people on this panel and as co-sponsors. So thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to stick around and talk a little more about the report later after the panel. But I just could not feel more grateful to be in a city where Shahana Hanif and Tiffany Caban are not just friends, not just teachers, not just leaders who are pushing all of us, but the council members that are fighting to bring that better city that really is worthy of all of us. Shahana and Tiffany, over to you.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Comptroller Lander. And I love reading all of these responses to this really big question for our city. What is the feminist recovery? This was a big part of the campaign I ran. And that is what we wanted our neighbors in the 39th district, which I'm so proud to represent, to stretch their muscles around. And so really excited that, in the first 100 days of my time in office, that we're really able to build out this work around actualizing a feminist recovery for New York City. So I'm really excited and thrilled and enthusiastic, energized. Today's been a really long day, and I know many folks on this call relate that this has been a big week. I am super excited for tonight's feminist takeover. I see tonight as an opportunity to share a gender-forward, gender-responsive vision for a feminist city and a feminist recovery. Our governments have not led in this way. And so we know this is a very tough, this is a uncomfortable uncomfortable muscle to build, and a very tough call to action for the three of us, three legislators, in pushing New Yorkers, our neighbors, our constituents, to reorient the way we think about the present and future recovery of the city, which cannot be done or cannot be won without centering women's needs first and at the center. We know that women, and particularly women of color, bore the brunt of COVID and continue to bear that brunt, and continue to bear the brunt in helping New Yorkers survive COVID. And we say feminist because that is the only way forward for us. That is the only way forward for us. It means that getting to the city we want for all of us will require dismantling patriarchy, a system that reinforces policymaking built around control and domination. It means that getting to the city we want for all of us will require challenging patriarchy, centering gender justice, and enforcing transparency and accountability, and it will require feminist leadership. For me, this work is deeply personal. I was born and raised in Brooklyn and have the deep privilege and honor of representing my home community of Kensington along the broad swath of neighborhoods in the 39th district, which include Park Slope, Carroll Gardens, Cobble Hill, Gowanus, slivers of Borough Park and Windsor Terrace, the Columbia waterfront. And I came into this work through my diagnosis with lupus. And I've talked very openly about being a council member living with lupus. And just over a month ago, I got my left hip replaced again. And so I've been a legislator who has been very vocal about needing telework and being at the forefront of those conversations about how we need to transform what work looks like, what productivity means in this city. I was diagnosed at 17. And so this work for me started as a youth activist. Lupus allowed me to recognize a couple of things. The city is inaccessible for people with disabilities, from our streets to our schools to our workplaces. And as a result, it is really, really easy to be on the receiving end of exploitation and violence. And as a woman of color, that is also sexist exploitation. And having realized that I could not separate my gendered experiences from the fight to make our city better, just, more equitable, a friend gifted me Bell Hooks's Feminism is for Everybody. And Bell Hooks says, feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. That is the most clear definition of feminism that I carry with me every single day. And of course, I invite you to carry that definition with you in thinking about what a feminist recovery means. And I invite you to read Bell Hooks's works. I'm proud to be a freshman council member, to have run on an explicitly feminist vision of governance, and to see us move towards actualizing the possibilities in collaboration with the brilliant, genius panelists you will hear from tonight. These are scholars of our time with creative solutions and expertise on strategies rooted in deep community organizing, deep community building, and rooted in a block by block approach. We're really honored to have them with us and to have them lead us. So I'm grateful. I'm really excited that those of you who are here with us tonight will get to hear from them and learn from them. And of course, just big shout out and deep love to my council colleague, council member Tiffany Caban, and my mentor and predecessor. I come after a giant like former council member Lander. And so it is a deep honor to do this work together and to do it with urgency right now at this moment. I want to pass the mic along to Tiffany Caban.
Thank you. Thank you. thank all of you for being here. Thanks Sadie's mom, who's up in the chat. I'm very excited to join my colleagues, Comptroller Lander and Councilmember Hanif, and just like echo all of the sentiments that they shared. There's a lot of love amongst us all. But I also want to thank our super dope, illustrious panelists for a discussion I consider to be incredibly vital and super timely. And I want to start out by expressing my appreciation for the title of this event, A Feminist Recovery, right? And as some of y'all might know, I'm the chair of the Council Committee on Women and Gender Equity. And I gotta be honest with you, I have to confess a little bit. I'm like sometimes a little troubled by that name because, you know, to my way of thinking, like women and men are not exactly the right categories for our work, right? So I consider feminism and patriarchy to be a much more useful, you know, conceptual framework or frameworks, right? Because patriarchal policies and forms of governance are characterized by, and these were hit by Shahana a little bit, but punishment, separation, exclusion, competition, violence, force, control, threat, and hierarchy. And patriarchal tactics and strategies include policing, prosecution, incarceration, eviction, family separation, destruction of homeless encampments, and refusal to deliver healthcare owing to insurance or immigration status. And so these approaches seek not to meet people's needs, but rather to manage the fallout of unmet needs by using force to impose control but like to the contrary, or in contrast, a feminist recovery is characterized by care, compassion, replenishment, growth, healing, restoration, transformation, cooperation, and connection. And feminist tactics and strategies include guaranteeing comfortable housing, meaningful employment, a healthy environment complete with clean air and water and nutritious food, a decent education, abundant healthcare resources, including mental health care and reproductive health care.
Is this Ms. Pierre?
Yes, speaking.
Hi, this is Nancy at the Atrium Rehabilitation Center. Just calling in regards to your mom. She's okay. But while the staff were trying to
Let's get a mute going there. And
quickly pull herself out and put herself on the floor.
I love
As
Zoom
I
for all-
talk about abundant
You said that
healthcare,
she put her.
Yes, we love a mute. Thank you. And we also love to keep it lively. Tiffany, let's stay on our
Yeah,
toes.
no, there we go. We're good. That was right on cue because, like I said,
¿Alguien habla español?
include abundant healthcare resources.
¿Alguien?
I think we've got to put the Spanish interpreter back in the interpretation.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm
All
sorry
right.
about that.
It's okay. Muchas gracias. Okay, go ahead.
All right, we got this. But yes, picking up on what those things include, right? Guaranteeing that those abundant healthcare resources, mental health care, reproductive health care, and well-funded violence prevention and interruption programs, and reliable, affordable transit options. And these approaches, they seek to actually meet people's needs and thereby eliminate the need to manage the fallout with control and force, right? And so I just implore people to notice how these categories differ from just women and men, right? And in our time and in this place, women manage some of the most brutal patriarchal systems and apparatuses. Men serve some of the most life-affirming feminist organizations and institutions, and plenty of people who are don't identify as men or women, right? That are gender expansive, that are non-binary, participate in patriarchal or feminist processes and practices. And so, even with feminism and patriarchy as our models, we still find that it is not a clean binary. Our Department of Education schools are sites of immense nurturing, exploration, care, and growth, but also contain elements of social control, surveillance, and enforced double standards. Right? The Administration for Children's Services provides family enrichment centers that connect families to services, no questions asked, but also affects family separations that disproportionately impact Black and Brown families. In our Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, healthcare system saves lives, it delivers care, and provides safety and compassion, but also excludes people on the basis of economic position or documentation status, and produces disparate outcomes depending on ethnicity, gender, and other classifications. Like the list goes on and on. And so discerning these differences takes critical thinking, intentionality, and compassion It takes good listening, especially to those people most directly impacted. It takes co-governance with courageous, visionary, community-based organizations. And it takes uniting across differences with others, both other elected leaders and everyday New Yorkers, to advance our feminist agenda in the halls of power and at the neighborhood level. And that's why I'm so proud to be here with y'all. We are the ones who will move our city towards the feminist future we know is the key to true public safety, true public health, and dignity and freedom for everyone, regardless of their gender. So thank y'all. I'm looking forward to this.
Ooh, beautiful, beautiful remarks and beautiful modeling of equity and flexibility, which is what all of us have continued to embody throughout this pandemic. So we really appreciate everybody's grace here. I'm going to introduce our panelists this evening. I'm going to do it quickly because we're behind time, but want to acknowledge that we are full people way beyond job titles, that job titles come and go, and that we contribute lots to this world way beyond sort of the things we have done in the productivity, but it's also important to name. So without further ado, Prathana Gurung is the Director of Campaigns and Communications at Adhikar, a worker and community center based in Woodside, Queens, that serves and organizes the rapidly growing Nepalese-speaking community. She's worked in a diverse array of communities and campaigns over the last decade, organizing nail techs and many more for safe and just working environments. We welcome Prathana. Thank you so much for being here. We have Chanel Portia of Ancient Song Doula Services, which already sounds healing, so I want to thank you for your service. Commissioner Chanel, because she was recently appointed by the New York City Mayor's Commission on Gender Equity, the advisory board member, and she's an advisory board member for Marymount College. She also works as she founded Ancient Song Doula Services, a reproductive health organization focused on producing resources and a full spectrum doula services to women of color and marginalized communities. We need it more than ever, and we're so thankful for your service. She also has 6 children, and so shout out to all the amazingness that it takes to be that person. We applaud you and salute you. Beverly Tillery is the executive director for New York City Anti-Violence Project. This organization empowers LGBT community and HIV affected folks and allies who have experienced any forms and all forms of violence. She does this through organizing and education. She supports survivors through counseling and advocacy. She's an experienced thought leader, advocate, national organizer, and she lives in Harlem with her teenage daughter. Goddess bless Beverly for surviving the teenage years. I know I gave my mom a run for her money. Marisa Centeno is with us this evening from the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She's the New York director. She's leading voice for nannies, for house cleaners, for caregivers across the country. So all of us can relate to some sense of that, and we want to thank her for her work. She's organized domestic workers for the last 15 years, and she loves to focus on how domestic workers can access justice in the workplace. She lives in Queens with her son, who is in middle school. Antonine Pierre, who I've known for many, many moons, and we're so excited that she's becoming the executive director of the Brooklyn Movement Center. We want to give her a shout out for leading the way consistently. Her passion for organizing is grounded in her Haitian immigrant upbringing in the Giuliani era of New York. She's co-founded No Disrespect, Brooklyn Movement Center's abolitionist anti-street harassment collective. She's an amazing voice, an amazing force, and she's working towards an Afro future, which we also support and believe. She loves to bike around her native Flatbush, and she's married to Jeffrey. Shout out to Jeffrey for holding up such a queen. And last but not least, Jimena Bustamante. Jimena is a Latin American organizer at the crossroads of feminism, labor, and immigration. So basically, she does a lot of easy work, no big deal. She's one of the lead organizers of Women's Strike NYC, a coalition, a community of labor and feminist organizations that has been convening marches, International Working Women's Day, March 8th, and grassroots history movements as well. She's a member of 9M Translocal, a network of organizers and projects rooted on popular feminisms across the continent. She also is an interpreter and a translator and models the difference between simply language access, but really brings us to language justice. We want to thank her for her work. Phew, what a powerful group. I know that was fast, so I would encourage you all to introduce yourself in chat as well, your name, your pronoun, and sort of anything that you want to add that I missed or glazed over, so people can also sit with it at their own pace. I want to jump into the first question, which is in the bucket of the economic justice and care economy category. It goes without saying that the pandemic exposed deeply seated racism, problems, gaps in our social safety net, also our relationship to paid and unpaid work, with low-wage immigrant women taking on disproportionate share of essential work. I think we all felt that in our homes. Prathana, can you talk a bit about how you saw these dynamics play out? And specifically in the Nepali speaking community and the community's response to these adversities, but also adversaries.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sadie. I'm honored to be here with everyone. And Sadie, I think this piece that you bring up in your question around paid and unpaid labor and what's seen as quote unquote formal labor is just so key in understanding what the pandemic did to women in our communities, right? And continues to this day. I actually want to start off with a story. Her name's Maya. She's a nail salon worker, member of ours. And Maya's a mom. She's become an activist. She's a gem of a person. She's worked in the industry for almost 10 years. And she walked through Adhikar's doors about 5 years ago, looking for support for a worker license. Not only was English a challenge for her, but her limited literacy and schooling from back in Nepal also made it that much harder for her to get the workforce development that she needed. She was fairly active in her cultural community organizations in her neighborhood, but she shared with us her frustrations about how the male-dominated space was a very obvious ceiling to her growth. And so she found space at Adhikar, right? And years later, we're here. Maya's a trainer. She's teaching virtual classes to her peers to make sure that they can get the license to be more confident as nail techs. She led mutual aid operations in her neighborhood to other nail techs and their families during the pandemic with us. And she learned also how to be a mental health counselor to peers. She's even taken on these skills and is on our worker leadership committee, and she's organizing with us to win the Nail Salon Minimum Standards Council Act at the state level, which would basically create a table for workers to be held directly by the government. Maya can be very unassuming, but when given the space, she really glows up and shines, and people quiet down to hear her speak. And to me, Maya is someone who really defines what we at Adhikar believe to be a feminist path for recovery, right? She really exemplifies, I think, how we live and breathe our theory of change at Adhikar, of guiding members from services to political education, to leadership development, and into fighting side by side for advocacy for structural change. You know, historically, our communities are not recognized, so they're underserved, they're undercounted, and they're underfunded, which is why worker centers like us have to exist, right? We're our communities 911 and 311. So as a women-led worker center, we have about a 6,000 strong membership. They're predominantly women identifying, and they work primarily in what are seen as feminine industries, right? Domestic work and beauty and nail salons. And we serve and organize workers, as you said, in the Nepali speaking community, which actually means there are people from Nepal, from Tibet, from Bhutan, from India, and from Burma. And we're one of the newest immigrant communities and also the fastest growing Asian ethnic group. Over the course of the pandemic, what we saw is that women workers like Maya and others, they saw a myriad of issues emerge that were compounded by their gender, plus their role of being sole caretakers in their families, plus being low-wage workers in unregulated industries, right? They had issues, for example, domestic worker members were sharing how they're being forced to take in public transportation for fear of losing their one source of income, or being forced to transition into quote unquote live-in jobs, which essentially means working and living at their employers. But these situations are undesirable because they create greater exploitation because of the boundarylessness of work, right, and personal space. And obviously nail salon workers were 100% out of a job, they were left without an income, and many were excluded workers. When things reopened, the issues continued. We had nail salon worker members reporting not being able to go back because of lack of childcare. Among both nail salon and domestic workers, vaccination was not prioritized by the state. It was very unclear as to when they would be prioritized for the rollout, regardless of the high exposure on the job. Members reported having to take their own PPE to work because employers were not providing them, or instead would charge them for them, or having to reuse PPE. And then workers were also just sharing about how much fear that they had going to work in case that they would get their vulnerable elders or children sick when they returned. It's also no coincidence that our communities are concentrated in Northwest Queens near Elmhurst Hospital, which was the epicenter of the pandemic's earlier days. Our phone lines were constantly ringing off the hook, and 24/7 as thousands of members are reaching out to support. And so it was a really overwhelming time. But I think what was most beautiful about this moment of community in the crisis was how our member-led committees organized to build out mutual aid and with their peers, right? As a staff of 14, we can only do so much ourselves. And there was so much beauty and power in the hundreds of member leaders who came together to support in helping distribute emergency relief funds, PPE, facilitated unemployment insurance through our UI clinics. And all of these things to me was seeing feminist theory in practice, right? In the most difficult of times, it's a really astounding thing to bear witness to. And we saw how creative and with such little material resources, our members were able to identify moments of opportunity in this moment of crisis, in moments of collaboration, and look at things from a lens of abundance as opposed to a lens of scarcity. And, we know that even before the words mutual aid became a commonly recognized term, mutual aid is exactly how our communities have been surviving for decades, right? And, a lot of what we were doing wasn't just stopping at mutual aid, but it actually went deeper. We were able to recognize an opportunity to engage members into channeling their emotions, the anger, the fear, the frustrations, into action and visioning through political ed. We were doing weekly member meetings, Zoom small group sessions across our memberships to create a space for them, for us to raise their political knowledge on what was happening around them and the why, right? And so that they could have the tools to be part of collective action. And we also engage members in opportunity for advocacy. For example, when the reopening of nail salons in the state, guidelines came out, workers were saying that that wasn't enough, right? And so we brainstormed with them to say, what are the conditions and the health and safety conditions you need to feel safe to go back to work? And we negotiated these with the state successfully, and they were actually implemented. So, keeping all of these things in mind, to me, these are examples of how our member leaders really exemplify feminist principles, right? Principles mentioned before, right, by other speakers, but also things like collectivism, investing in generative and transformative work, honoring complexity in intersectional issues, but then also in the solutions themselves, and embodying principles like care and healing versus harm. And, again, this is not something new or learned because of the pandemic crisis, but rather something inherent, right, in our members. And it's, it's part of our DNA. It's part of our community's DNA. And it's a path forward for us to learn from, really, and that we have an opportunity now to continue. Obviously these principles, as Councilmember Caban mentioned, they're not just reserved for people who identify as women, right, or women identifying, but rather it's an ideology, right? It's a way of survival and it's a way of life. So for us at Adhikar, a feminist agenda in the city budget, what that means is that we have to invest in those at the margins, right? We have to invest in working class folks of color, women, immigrants, and raise the floor for them, because what that means is then you're raising the floor for everyone. And so that's why I think it's really critical for us to fund more workers' initiatives, for example. The city has the opportunity to fund 2 new initiatives right now geared at uplifting nail salon and domestic workers, these 2 industries that are predominantly women of color and immigrant workers. And then 2 to fund worker centers like Adhikar and so many other worker centers in the city, right, that are created, developed, and led by women of color and immigrant women. So I'll close out there a little bit.
I was going to say thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you all for the platform to share a little bit of work. So I'll hand it off to you, Sadie.
I appreciate it. I think people are going to want to hear more. And so if you have a website, put it in the chat. We want to make sure that people get access to it. I also just want to lift up that we say you center people, center these folks, and that you brought actual nail salon workers to the state and that they informed policy. And guess what? The public policy actually was reflective of needs and was better for it, is exactly what we're trying to hammer home. So I want to thank you for your work and thank you for being a haven for who is a deeply important population to many New York City people. Marisa, this question is for you. It's about domestic workers. They've experienced significant job losses and job insecurity, specifically as a result of the pandemic. In what ways do you think that the frequent exclusion of domestic workers from formal economic data and policymaking contributed to these impacts? What lessons should we learn? And especially, for the people who are listening, how can they sort of connect their own experience to the work that you're doing?
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me here tonight. And, listening to Pratana, I just love hearing organizing, empower stories about women and feminism, because this is where it's at, by the way. This is where we get it done. And that's kind of like where I want to stay. But just to let you know a little bit about who I am and what we do, I'm Marisa Centeno. I'm with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. We are the leading voice for the house cleaners, nannies, and care workers across the country. In the United States, there's over 2.5 million domestic workers. In New York City alone, we have well over 250,000 domestic workers. I'll get back to that number in a second. And they are the women that are mostly 94% female workers, 81% of whom are immigrants, and 32% of domestic workers are Black. And those percentages are approximately double for domestic workers than the representative of the share of work that women, immigrant workers, and Black workers do in general across the workforce in New York State. And their median annual income in New York City is about $21,000. Actually, that statistic hails from pre-pandemic. So you can imagine at the height of the pandemic, we surveyed workers, and of those surveyed, 85% of those had lost their jobs. And now that we're in transition, we're just barely getting to an area where we can find out what's happening, what is the state of the care industry currently as is, and how are we looking forward. For domestic workers, it's not a mistake that there isn't enough data on the industry. The exclusions are both historic and holdovers of systemic racism, because back in the 1930s, when we created what is generally recognized as labor standards, domestic workers, farm workers, and service workers were excluded specifically because of their race, because they were Black. It's 2022, and we're still adjusting for fighting for and correcting those historical wrongs. And what happened during the pandemic was not only did everyone see the bottom fall out of the care industry, right? Suddenly we're all having to work from home. We're having to school from home. We're having to care from home. And then domestic workers are having to leave their homes to go care for everyone else. And there was no safety net no economic recovery fast enough, something that didn't connect within the communities, living in the communities that had to give up the most of themselves in order to put food on the table. And what we would have seen as a hugely disempowering event, like these mass layoffs, massive incidences of hunger and risking homelessness, we saw domestic workers coming forward, and we saw them pull up in their leadership. But leadership doesn't happen on its own, right? We had been investing for many years in our domestic worker leaders, and they were coming forward, and they were deciding that they weren't going to go back to normal whenever this pandemic was over. That normal was never working for them. And so what we needed to do was listen to their demands, which is that not only are we going to fix the historical wrongs, but we're going to start like really building out the infrastructure. And the pandemic actually created one of like the biggest like wins that I've ever seen for domestic work in recent history and for women of color. It was 2021, and we still had a situation where domestic workers weren't included in human rights protections in New York City and New York State. They decided that wasn't going to be the case anymore. And through massive organizing, domestic workers decided that they were going to ensure that all the council members, council member at the time, Brad Lander, now comptroller, was with us on that journey. And what we found was that in 2022, we were going to step into this new role of having new laws that we could enforce and empower workers with. That you can go to work with dignity, knowing that you wouldn't be discriminated against because of your gender, your race, because of your caregiving status. I sort of sidelined that a little bit, or kind of sidetracked a little bit, because I enjoy a good organizing story. But what I wanted to say really is about how feminist recovery can be defined as placing true value on care work, which is extremely gendered, right? Both paid and unpaid, right? And that is done in order to undervalue the role it plays in society. And the reason that we don't have enough data on domestic workers, domestic employers, is because this is work that's done in the shadows. Every time you go to someone's home to clean their homes, a door closes behind them and they're like lost from view. And societally, these are women, mostly majority women, who society has decided that we're going to make invisible. Undocumented workers, immigrant workers, Black women, right? It was the way to invisibilize all of these women doing all of this work. But what happens? That means that also the work I do as a mother, the work that I do as like a daughter of aging parents, the work that is unpaid to care for my own home and my own family is also undervalued. And so when I need supports for care, it's not there. That's what we saw happen during the pandemic. And for domestic workers, it wasn't there. So what's our solution? We're going to assign, again, true value to care work, and we want to invest in women's leadership. For me, investing in women's leadership at all levels really I have not seen it, pay back tenfold. And for us, we are proposing a domestic worker initiative, one that will establish a peer-led outreach and education program that will inform domestic workers and employers about their rights, to build their capacity to better inform and enforce their rights, and to facilitate key referrals for the financial and legal services in New York City. We're doing this as a part of coalition between domestic worker advocacy groups, including Adhikar here tonight, Hand in Hand, Carroll Gardens Association, and Hand in Hand notably is the Domestic Employer Network. And so what I wanted to note with that is our futures are interconnected, right? Care work is connected to everybody. We all need care at some point in our lives. And so when we invest soundly in domestic work, in our care infrastructure, we're investing in ourselves and our own future and health of our city. So we want to make sure that domestic workers are the ones building out the infrastructure, right? That this isn't just like resources we're looking to receive. These are resources we're looking in order to help create. We want to create the infrastructure and provide that like scaffolding that the city can then take as like models and plans of what to replicate in other sectors, in other industries, right? And this is what we want to do. We want to be able to co-enforce, co-create, and even co-manage our futures together. So with that, we are proposing a domestic worker and employer empowerment initiative. And for me, feminist recovery really means assigning the true value to the care work that is done all across society and the true value of the leadership that we see every single day. So I'll leave you with that. And I look so forward to hearing the rest of the panelists.
Marisa, I'm just sensing, but I'm also watching people's face. That was really powerful. Ooh, I'm like holding that. I'm also holding that you are shepherding this sort of silenced population on your shoulders too, but the way you articulated that we go to communities, the care worker community, as experts who have expertise, who have resources, who have an inherent resource, who have knowledge, is the lesson that we all needed. And I want to just sort of thank you and just hold you in this space because I feel it from here. And so thank you so very much. We all needed to hear that. And I appreciate it. And it's a really great segue to hear from Jimena, who is part of the Undocumented Women's Fund. This was created during the pandemic as a response to the lack of feminist responses from both the government and nonprofit side. Can you, Jimena, share how your grassroots organizing led to this fund and what do we need to know about it?
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I feel like really honored to be, like a part of this amazing crew of organizers. And now after hearing everyone, like my own ideas all melting and mixing with what everyone has been sharing so far. And actually there are many points of coincidence, and which is, like very encouraging. Before getting, like to the Undocumented Women's Fund and how it emerged, I wanna just share, like a few remarks on what the analysis that we have at the fund of what happened has been, right? Like what has happened in these couple of years. We've been hearing, like from the other panelists about how we need to, when we are doing a feminist analysis or feminist politics, we really need to go beyond, like our understanding of the formal economy, but also we need to see, like the conditions under which wage labor or quote unquote formal labor takes place, right? And I believe that what that leads us to is on the one hand, of course, to recognize that the pandemic has meant massive unemployment for women, like especially in low wage, like precarious sectors, right? But also that, as Marisa and Pratana have shared, those that kept any type of paid employment did so under conditions of intense exploitation, precarity, and lack of safety, right? And I think that it's very relevant to highlight how we are in a situation in which we're seeing massive unemployment for women, and at the same time where women are performing more work than ever, right? Due to, of course, the massive amount of care work that has been outsourced into households. And for us in the Documented Women's Fund to bring a feminist analysis to this situation and to act accordingly require us to really see the systemic causes of that. Like, why is it that women have been the most affected, both in terms of paid employment and in terms of, like an increase of unpaid labor and a lack of access for many of them, especially the population that we work with, a lack of access, like to all sorts of services, right? Like an exclusion from safety nets. And, like in that sense, we really want to bring a word into this discussion that I've been hearing in what Marisa said, a lot of this, like the idea of the chains of care work, right? Like for a long time, like the feminist movement has been saying that care work is what makes all other work possible, right? And what that means is that care work cannot stop, right? It's essential because, like it's what keeps people alive, right? Like it keeps all of us alive. So when we think about, like chains of care work, we need to think about how the life of some depends on the work of others, and that kind of like goes down the ladder, right? And it also, like requires us to see how, like what we have been seeing during the pandemic is the consequences of decades of neoliberal policies, right? That have really dismantled all the systems to sustain life in common and to provide care, right? Like, so it has, like these policies have dismantled, like the healthcare system, education, food production, public infrastructure, transportation, right? And like COVID has allowed us to see the connection among all of those, and how, like why women are bearing the brunt, like of all of those cuts, and why they are being the most affected, and also who among, like this big category that we say women are like the most vulnerable links in that kind of like change of care work, right? We have seen, for example, that, like hospitals and schools became shock points, right? Like during the pandemic, due to years of disinvestment, right? Like, and privatization. But then, like while healthcare workers and educators were keeping, like everyone alive, right? Like, and taking care of the children of others and the family of others, they themselves and every other women also needed, like someone to take care of their own family to continue working, right? And then we go back to what Marisa was saying, where we see, like that then you need, like this massive amount of workers that need to take care of someone else's household, right? Keep alive someone else, their children, their elderly, feed someone else, right? And the question is then who takes care of caregivers, right? If we go down the ladder, like who is at the bottom? And I believe that we should say, like undocumented women are some of the ones that have been sustaining the life of themselves, of their households, of their communities, and of other people's households. And at the same time, they have been completely excluded, from all forms of relief. And this is something that other panelists have already explained, right? So what we saw as, like community organizers is, like we just like had to come together to respond to the situation, because we knew that there were already multiple exclusions for undocumented women and for undocumented workers in general. But then, like when the pandemic began, it became immediately clear for many of us, like feminist organizers, that this was going to affect disproportionately women and affect undocumented women, and that there was going to be no response, or very limited and inefficient and response on behalf of the state, right? So what happened is that in like in the lack of in the facing the exclusion from all forms of relief, what we did with several organizers is get together and raise funds. And this goes back to what I believe Pratana was mentioning about mutual aid, right? Like we created this feminist mutual aid network and began just raising funds to be able to put cash in the hands of undocumented women, right? First of all, because we understood that having disposable income, like not only receiving goods, not only going to a food pantry and like getting things, like in kind, let's say, but having money that women could decide how to spend was vital. And just the very process of putting money on the hands of undocumented women revealed to us the deepness of the exclusion, right? Because, like just that very transaction is incredibly difficult given the exclusion from the financial system that undocumented women and workers experience, right? So we began raising money with the, like immense support of many people across New York, mostly women, but not only, that donated, like out of their own stimulus checks or out of or their unemployment, right? And just like, so we have been giving, like dozens of grants. And while doing so, we also develop needs assessment tools to better understand what was happening in the community. So not only, like providing money, but understanding what is happening in all of the different areas of need. And and of course, connecting women with all of the resources possible, because we discovered that even those things that undocumented women can theoretically access, the barriers to access are enormous, right? So we facilitated and have been facilitating that connection. And also we've been having discussions with the women. I mean, we call it Red Comadre, like all of the women that have received this kind of direct income, from the fund. We have been really politicizing needs, meaning, and politicizing, I mean, speaking about the political implications, why are we in need, right? Like, and to remove the stigma from the need and to bring it to a political reading. And therefore, while we build this network of support, also ask what else do we need? Like how do we expand this network, how we deepen it, and how we like fight for more. And this is where I think that the question of the budget comes through. I mean, as I said, we emerged as part of a mutual aid network, and we are deeply embedded on it in like in terms of principles and how we organize. However, like it's not enough, right? Like you can only get so far. So the donations, and every mutual aid group in the city can tell you, have dried out, right? As the money that people were receiving has reduced. Well, I mean, all of us mutual aid groups have been really struggling, right? And also volunteer labor, which is what we have been depending on, has also waned, right? So this is, like when actually state money began coming into the picture, like after more than 1 year of struggle, some of the relief programs began including undocumented workers. But, like the take that we have on that is that sometimes those, frequently, let's say, many of those programs have been really insufficient, like that, like sometimes putting money into something doesn't mean addressing the inequities, right? Like, and what we have been seeing is that a lot of the money has gone, is not going through direct transfers, like we don't have anything close to a care income, which the undocumented women's fund thinks that we should have, right? Like, but also that, like the money is not necessarily going to the organizations that are doing the work in the grass, like close to the grassroots, right? And this is something that we really want to push for, like, because mutual aid endeavors can only get so far. We need institutional money, and we believe that the state money is the people's money, right? Like, so we really want to also push forward for mechanisms for participatory budgeting and for providing support to grassroots organizations that continue doing the work, because what we have been seeing so far is millions of dollars put into programs that have really created a very strong non-state bureaucracy. Like some organizations that are middle-sized or very big have become even bigger, and then the small ones are weaker, right? Like, so we really need a shift. For us, feminist recovery means also a shift in how we allocate priorities, and how the budget is designed and how grassroots endeavors are supported. So well, I think that's what we wanted to share.
Oh, there's no big deal. That's it. Jimena, you're
On a nutshell.
Yes, well, listen, it's not a nutshell, and it's very clear and resonates across the screen how much of an expert you are. But I also want to lift up that undocumented workers, and we just say, oh, undocumented workers, like these people don't just go and show up to places and ask for money and don't just organize themselves. There are threats every place for these folks at this point, and it is a reflection of you and your community of organizers that creates that community safety for them to go. That they would never show up and you wouldn't have money to run out if they didn't feel that safety from you. And so acknowledging you in that work, but also, of course, the amazing organizing that you have done and are doing. And I also feel that. So thank you. It's a great segue to community safety. And Antonine, I'm just going to bring you up because I'm not going to rush anybody, but just acknowledging time here and these stories and your populations for whom you're speaking often get rushed and silenced. And so I'm disrupting patriarchy by being like, we're just going to keep going, but also acknowledging time. And so Antonine, and thank you, Beverly, for your grace for flipping the order here. But Antonine, community safety. These last 2 years have not only posed challenges to women's economic security, but also physical safety and beyond. When you say you've been a longtime fighter for community safety, what is community safety? What sort of investments should the city make in this fiscal year to support community safety? And it was really important for us to make sure that the audience understood sort of how can we support you supporting community safety to ensure that women are free from state and interpersonal violence? So this is a really light question. Why don't you go ahead, and I'm sure you'll solve it in the next few minutes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the kicker here. And so, hey, folks. So, folks who may not know me, my name is Antonine Pierre. I'm at the Brooklyn Movement Center. We are a Black-led base building organization in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. And our work really is to make sure that everyone who lives in Central Brooklyn has the same fair shot at a safe and healthy future, right? And we do that by developing the Black leadership of Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. And so one thing I want to name, and I really appreciate, Shahana, in your earlier remarks, hearkening back to some feminist history here. And I want to name, in particular, I also want to name the Combahee River Collective and really name that, I think that what feels really amazing and dynamic about this group of folks is that we're all out here representing more than one identity. And I feel like, the Combahee Collective did such a good job of very much naming very publicly that sexual oppression is experienced simultaneous to race oppression and class oppression. And I name this here because I know that there may even be people who came on the line who were like, a feminist recovery, right? Like rolling your eyes, right? Like, what is this? What kind of feminism are we talking about here? And so I really want to uplift and appreciate that we're talking about, if there is a feminist recovery, it really has to be the kind of feminist recovery that lifts everyone, right? Like what we're talking about is using the frame of feminism to really create a different world, a different New York, because so many of our families are women-led. Just like you, Sadie, I was raised by a single mom here in New York. And so if we're for real about a feminist recovery, it has to be one designed around collective liberation. And so if we start with that frame and we start talking about safety, I want to use another phrase that is often used when we talk about safety, which is quality of life, right? And yet, like when we talk about quality of life in the safety conversation, what often happens is we're talking about quality of life offensive. We're talking about broken windows policing. We're talking about you jumped a turnstile, you were drinking an open container, now you have an open case, you might not be able to work, et cetera, right? And I bring that up because, after 2 years of living in a pandemic, I think we all have a very different idea of what quality of life actually means. And to actually have a quality of life that will actually move all of us, every member of your family and mine, to a safe and healthy future, we really need to think of quality of life in terms of where there's lack, where people have lost a lot, and what honestly really keeps people up at night when they're thinking about whether or not they're going to be able to make it to the future with their children, with the rest of their family. And so to talk about a feminist recovery in terms of community safety, we need to meet people's most basic needs, right? Like we need to be talking about affordable housing. We're living in a city where so many of us, I'm sure, have been doing our Twitter scrolls and turning on our television and seeing that we have got a mayor who's been destroying homeless encampments all around the city, right? And that, so when we're talking about quality of life, we wanna make sure that unhoused people have homes, but we also wanna make sure that we do that in a way that's sustainable, that provides the resources that folks may need, whether that's mental health services, whether that's substance use services, whether that's connecting folks to long-term affordable housing as opposed to shelter. So it really feels important. Like you can't talk about a household if you don't have a house, right? And then, again, after being in 2 years of a pandemic, we all have mental health concerns, right? Like literally, there's not a person alive on the face of this earth who is not struggling from the backlash of COVID, right? And so we need comprehensive health and mental health care services. And, I think in the past, so much of the conversation around health has been around access, and it continues and should continue to be about access. But I think, the way that we talk about access has actually shifted, right? Because what we see is that we've got this, we know New York City, right? There's a ton of racial and spatial violence that actually segregates and concentrates poverty in certain neighborhoods. And we're talking about certain neighborhoods, I'm talking about Central Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights. I'm talking about Jamaica, Queens. I'm talking about Soundview, Harlem, the North Shore of Staten Island, right? Like if we go through all of the boroughs, we know exactly where these concentrations are happening. And if we really want to make sure that people are well, then we need to actually be able to concentrate services instead of poverty, right? And that means, but like one of those services that we need that I think many folks have said already tonight is jobs, right? So straight up and down, if people do not have jobs and do not have access to the kinds of jobs that they can pay their rent with, then you're going to have a lot of safety problems, because we know that poverty is one of the biggest drivers of property crime. And we know that, and that inequity in particular, like having a rich neighbor next to a low income neighbor, makes it very difficult when you're talking about, I don't have, and like, I need to get, right? And I say that also understanding that, like, no one is saying that poor people steal, right? Like, that's not what's going on here. I think what I'm really trying to make very clear is that very often the kinds of property crime that we're seeing in our neighborhoods, that we're seeing in Black and brown and low income neighborhoods, is driven by the fact that there are people in the neighborhood who have more, and government is not doing enough to actually make sure that there is true neighborhood equity. And so if you want to be, if you want to be safe walking down the street as a woman, as a queer person, as a trans person, as a gender nonconforming person, then like you also need to understand what safety alternatives are, and in particular, what safety alternatives are to policing, right? Because we're also in a time where every problem, every kind of violence, where the solution we're being told is policing. And we're being told that it's public health, right? Like that like for the public health, for the good and the health of the public, we need more police. But when we look at policing, when we look at the anxiety, the depression, when we look at the isolation that comes from people living in neighborhoods that are over-policed, what we know, and that's even before we get into police effectiveness, but when we just look at how the presence of police actually impacts public health, what we actually get is the fact that there's no way that adding police can counteract the negative harms that policing brings. And so, we need to be in a conversation about what are the alternatives. And I know, shout out to Tiffany and Shahana here, who were this morning kind of going in on this city council budget hearing, because the safety alternatives that we need to be funding safety alternatives to the degree that we fund policing, right? Like, I think what needs to be over is, the little press conference, the little cure violence thing, look at us, like, let's clap for everybody, right? Because we're at a place where this concentrated poverty is unraveling the fabric of our entire city. And so if we want to move forward, if we want to see a feminist recovery, then we're going to need to see investments that are actually undermining and shifting and changing the fabric of the city, so that so that in some cases, like these places don't exist in the way that we currently know them, right? I think there's so much that I love about Central Brooklyn, and I want everybody who lives in Central Brooklyn to be able to have a job as easily as they could have a job if they're living in Park Slope, right? If they're living on the Upper East Side, if they're living on the Upper West Side. And so I know we're behind. I want to make sure I'm not rambling, but just to close out here to say that when we think about community safety, we really need to A, center around safety alternatives to police, and B, use government to provide a quality of life specifically for folks who are from communities that have been generationally disinvested in, right? Like when you're talking about a child born in Brownsville has a shorter life expectancy than a child born on the West Bank in Gaza, right? So like we need to raise the floor. We need to make sure that we're providing for folks, that folks have access, and that policing is not the answer to community safety. And that's just a shift that all of us need to do. And I'm gonna stop there.
Please don't stop ever, all of you guys, all of you, but especially, I think we hear the term community, safety and alternatives to police. And we as a community of learners and people who are experimenting towards a more just world need to be in practice of what does that mean? And so that's, I wasn't saying it to be cheeky, and you absolutely weren't rambling. It was like, no, what do we say? When Tiffany's over here saying community safety and Jimena's saying community safety, it's actually important that we hear what we align on what we mean. So it's mission critical what you said. Your contribution to the world and the language that we are using and need to use is really important now more than ever. So we see you and we thank you, and we also acknowledge your shoes in the background because I see you. It's fine. Don't think I didn't see you. All right, now let's go. Community safety is still on the mind, Beverly. I want you to reflect on your work, connecting it to obviously what we're talking about today. And of course, can you reflect a bit on what the last 2 years have exposed about our approach to interpersonal violence and building as a city?
Yeah. Oh, I'm just loving the way this conversation is building on each other. There's so much that I want to just like give love to the speakers who have gone before and the ones who are coming, because, like someone said, there's so much overlap in the work that we're doing and how we are thinking about, this idea of, what a feminist recovery looks like. I want to first just start out for folks who don't know. I'm from the New York City Anti-Violence Project, which is an organization that focuses on addressing and ending violence that impacts folks in the LGBTQ and HIV affected communities. And we do that in a number of ways. We both provide service and support to survivors of violence. So we run a 24-hour hotline. We provide counseling services and legal services free of charge. And we also do the work of organizing and advocacy to change the policies and conditions that lead to violence in the first place and make sure that survivors have what they need. I think that this idea of, what happened around interpersonal violence during COVID is a really important one. Some people have already touched on it. It was mentioned earlier, the increase in hate violence. We saw in our work increases in both hate violence and intimate partner or domestic violence during COVID. And that, that there was an exacerbation of really all kinds of violence, but particularly those two kinds of violence for members of our community. And we know other marginalized folks as well. And there was an increase in how that violence was playing out for people because of the isolation that we were all experiencing during COVID. We heard some about the ways that folks who are experiencing domestic violence and intimate partner violence were having even, more difficult times while sheltering in place with the folks who caused us harm. The thing that we haven't heard talked about as much is the way that that played out for hate violence as well. We heard from many people on our hotline who were experiencing violence, not just from intimate partners, but roommates, family members, neighbors. That hate violence that is always there really came more to the surface, and which was much more present. People had no way to get away from it. And one thing that was really interesting that we saw was, I'm sure related to the rent relief, we saw a lot of increased violence from landlords that people were experiencing, and a lot of sexual violence from landlords for people in our community as well. We took calls from tons of people who also were, as folks have already talked about, just dealing with all of the impacts of COVID. And violence was just one piece of the puzzle for many folks. But people were dealing with food insecurity, housing loss, and they were calling us really looking for services because services were very limited during COVID, and continue to be because not only were the communities that we served hurting, but our organizations were also hurting during COVID. And many of our organizations, we lost organizations, and many have not fully recovered. And so the services that were limited before COVID have really shrunk even more, and people have very little access to the resources that they need as survivors of violence, but just as people in our communities who are dealing with the aftermath and the continuation of COVID. We also, I just want to uplift also that, one of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet, particularly from an LGBTQ perspective, is just the impact of gender-based violence on all of our communities. And really wanted to say that, one of the things that, we saw and we continue to see is the spike, not only of hate violence in the LGBTQ community, but in particular, violence against trans folks, particularly Black trans women, that continues to increase. We hear the numbers of homicides across the country, but we should not be thinking that in New York, we are somehow outside of that. We have seen homicides of trans folks in our own city. And not only that, trans folks who work with us are often really dealing with a daily onslaught of violence as they try to move about the city. And we are here on the eve of Trans Day of Visibility, so I can't really talk about interpersonal violence without really uplifting the trans women in our community and acknowledging the violence that they experience daily. And really wanting to make sure that we're talking about a feminist recovery that acknowledges that trans women are women and is inclusive of gender nonconforming folks, non-binary folks, and other folks who are gender expansive, who often are not included in conversations when we're talking about feminism. And I really appreciate the remarks of Councilmember Cabal earlier, who really spoke to that really directly. I think we also want to talk about the relationship between interpersonal violence and state violence. You really can't talk about the violence that we experience individually as we walk around the city and our communities without acknowledging the state violence that is related to not only racist remarks and actions by our leaders nationally in local communities, the policies that we see sweeping through the country targeting LGBTQ, particularly trans folks, really attempting to take away the rights and humanity of people in our community, that is continuing to feed the hate violence that we're experiencing. And of course, you know, we've already been talking about a little bit, but the ever-present police violence that we experience here in our city and across the country. You know, we saw through the uprisings that happened during COVID that as people took to the streets, we saw the response that was very violent and from the NYPD. And, you know, just to continue the conversation about community safety, we know that we can't rely on a criminal legal system that is causing so many people in our communities harm. We can't rely on them to make us safer, and that we have to empower our own communities to really create and implement, again, those community-led safety models that are based and rooted in community members who are impacted by violence the most, so that those folks are identifying what they need, what we need to be safe, that we're bringing together the resources that we need to support the strategies that we are coming up with. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that we are employing in partnership with other organizations around the city to really think about this idea of moving away from reliance on policing for safety and really thinking about what really is going to make all of our communities safe. So we've been looking at ways to not just think about the responses to violence, but also how do we prevent violence? And a big part of what we've been doing, particularly around hate violence, but also now around intimate partner violence across the city, is working in partnership with other organizations to lead and conduct upstander and bystander trainings, really creating a culture and across the city that we all have to stand up for each other. And if we are not willing to stand up against the violence that is happening and for each other who are experiencing violence in our city, that we're never going to end the violence. And so we've been really we've seen an outpouring of people who are interested and really thirsty for information about how do you stand up for people in a safe way. And those trainings have been really amazing to see people coming, participating, and then taking that and putting it in action. Another component of community safety for us is also really putting the documentation of violence back into the hands of the communities. Again, not relying on just data from police, because we know many people are not going to the police. They don't feel comfortable or safe going to the police when they've experienced violence. But we do need the data about the violence that is happening to people. And so that needs to be put back into the hands of the organizations that people really trust. So we know that they will go to those organizations for support. And those organizations that are providing those support really need to be resourced and funded. And then, you know, I will just reiterate very quickly, you know, that we are also hearing from people that safety for them is having their basic needs met. When we ask survivors across the country and across the city what they need to be safe in New York City, LGBTQ survivors tell us that they need safe housing. They need not just shelter, but they need permanent housing. They need access to food. They need better employment opportunities. They need help getting schooling. And when we address these needs for long term, not just trying to meet immediate needs in crisis, we will actually start to build safer communities. And one of the things that I'm so excited about right now is that we have at this moment in New York City really an opportunity as we see so many threats happening across the country, we actually have an opportunity to really dig deep to fund some of these ideas and really create some new models for other people to really see in practice. So I'm really excited about this moment that we have in the city and the opportunities that we have to really support all of these ideas that this great panel is talking about.
Yes to Beverly reminding us to always center Black trans women every time, every single time, and to all of you for intentionally disrupting these notions of feminism. I think we shared that the councilwoman's concerns, right? Feminism, is that for me? And we are here practicing that it is absolutely for us and recentering it. So thank you so very much, Beverly. I remember when I was working at the Department of Education, we were shutting down schools because of the pandemic, and a student said, but where do I go if home isn't safe? And so really holding that, and then of course, all of the things you talked about, right? Domestic violence and beyond. So hard truths to hear and to hold, but if we are tasked with governing, we must hold all of that. So appreciate you, and sort of a good segue to the spirit of life, right? Like in all of these truths, we sort of look to the future of life. Chanel, this one's for you. Early on in the pandemic, people giving birth in hospitals were forced to do so without partners, without doulas, which to anyone who's done that, it sounds like really scary. In the end, and it was all in the interest of public health, of course, despite what we knew about the necessary pieces of having community with you. Can you share how the pandemic has impacted your work? And talk about the announcement made by the city last week about the focus and expansion of making doulas more accessible. And then, of course, what do all New Yorkers need to know about doulas? I think a lot of us are coming to this conversation from different knowledge bases, and so it would be good to just get a sense from you.
All right, greetings, everyone. First, I just want to lift up all of the panelists and the work that they're doing. And just realizing the intersections of how we are all centering and caring for our communities and how they're overlapping consistently. As I was listening to everyone, I was like, oh my goodness, like these are the things that show up for Black women and birthing people when we think about our reproductive health needs, when we think about what does it mean to choose to have a child or not to have a child, right? Do I have, equitable housing? Do I have access to the essentials? Such as food, do I have, am I accessing a space from being an undocumented person, being an incarcerated pregnant person? How are all of these things showing up for me at the site of reproduction and in parenting? And so, at Ancient Song, our focus is to center Black women and birthing people, those who are undocumented, by providing full spectrum doula care. So what that means is that we're meeting people where they are, not where we expect them to be. We're understanding the intersections of care and how, when it comes to Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples, and especially those of us who are at the intersections, how oftentimes the site of reproduction can be a site of criminalization and violence, right? How those things are continually perpetuated through hospital-based institutions, right? And so we're really looking at what does it mean to really decolonize this landscape, to look at it from a new viewpoint where we understand the systems of oppression and how, a lot of us don't have access or choice to go into any other space in order to give birth, right? And so that means that, we right now, what the pandemic did, it really uncovered the shamefulness of our healthcare infrastructure and the things that advocates have been talking about previously, where we needed more community-based midwifery and midwives to be available to offer services. And so we got a huge influx of people saying, listen, I'm really scared. I don't necessarily want to go to the hospital. Am I going to be seen? Am I not? People making the decision to cross the border, cross state lines to give birth, thinking that, they may have access in better places. Folks being concerned about being left at the wayside, which was a valid concern, right? Because if we think about the Black maternal mortality rate, where in New York City, pregnant people are 8 to 12 times more likely to die of a childbirth related complication prior to the pandemic. And now you have, on top of that, a major health crisis where no one is getting care, right? So now you have people who are not getting prenatal appointments. You have folks who are not getting routine checkups. You have individuals who are being separated from their partners or their support system and placed in a space where they're being treated like, some kind of situation that we see off of a movie, right? Where people are coming in full hazmat suits, masks on, and this is a time where you're bringing life into the world, right? And you're being completely isolated from other people. And at the start of the pandemic, because there wasn't enough education around what to expect, people were having their newborns being taken away from them, right? And so then you have this forced separation. And so what we really tried to do was to bridge the gap in being able to provide information and resources, right? Because in New York City, we don't have enough midwives, especially community-based midwives who to serve individuals in a really holistic way. And so what does it mean for us to, address that in a comprehensive way? We don't have enough birth centers. And, during the height of the pandemic, there was an executive order that, said that doulas are essential workers. Doulas need to be in spaces. People cannot give birth alone, should not have their children taken away from them and separated from them for any reason whatsoever. And that, we needed to have some sort of connection, right? And our work is really based on that, centering humanity and centering that human connection. And so once that, executive order was put in place, it allowed us to be able to freely support in a more beneficial way, but also the concerns of individuals, right? And so most doulas are not making a living wage. And so when, my co-panelists were talking about domestic workers, I see doulas in the same light. We're care workers, we're domestic workers. A lot of us have children ourselves. I have 6, New York City is not, paying, we're not making a living wage, right? We're not being able to be provided with the resources that are necessary to not only survive, but to thrive. And so some of the things that we were able to do was to create mutual aid, right, which has been mentioned. So at the Onslaught, we partnered with another community-based organization, Brooklyn Packers, to be able to offer, 50 boxes of groceries every month, essentials like diapers and, cleaning supplies, passing out masks. And we've continuously done that. And thinking about this from an intergenerational perspective, right? So not just pregnant and parenting individuals, but also what does it look like for our elders who may be caring for children, right? Who are on a fixed income, who don't necessarily have the resources to be able to tap in and say, oh, I can put additional funding there because now they've lost their job or their pensions are not, sustaining them. And so, through creating that pathway of offering those essentials, we've been able to really grow and offer, the services that are continuously lacking. I think what's been said and continues to be said is that we need to show up better for each other in more holistic ways, right? We need to center a framework of hope and humanity while also centering each individual's bodily autonomy, how they see themselves, how they're able to parent or not parent a child. And that's where the reproductive justice, birth justice framework really, comes into play. The new announcement of the citywide doula initiative gives us hope and being able to pay doulas a living wage for the work that they're doing. My hope is that through the way in which the program is set up, that we won't have any hiccups that can often happen with city-based contracts, because the city contracting, it's usually long, it's a tedious process. Getting reimbursed is also a tedious process. And these are people who need funds in immediacy. It's not like, oh, I'm doing this because this is my passion. It's, oh, also I'm doing this because it helps me to sustain myself. You know what I mean? And so being able to have that, that initiative be there and be in place is super, super important. And so again, I'm going to say that I'm hopeful and what it will achieve. But I'm also, very focused on what does it mean for us to build and continue to uplift community-based or other organizations and work to meet the intersections of like the things that come up on a daily basis. What does it mean for us to have true legislative policy that incorporates, certified professional midwives to be able to bridge the gap in care? What does it mean for us to put in implementation and accountability guidelines into the policies that we make, so that when we're making these policies that, we get really excited about, we're also following up and following through on like, how is it affecting community in like real time, and then revisiting those things, right? So what does it mean to have community stakeholders completely involved in every single process as it goes along? And then looking at Medicaid doula expansion. Previously in the state, it was initiated trying to roll it out as a pilot where doulas were only going to get reimbursed for $600 for the services that they provide, when doulas are there to offer this continuity of care that their providers are not giving them, right? Coming from a culturally congruent space, coming from a space that understands the impacts of racism, sexism, gender equity, understanding how, the hospital-based systems that we have are not set up in a way to really center the birthing person, the postpartum person who is, showing up and seeking care, and looking at that in really meaningful ways. And so what I would really love to see is how we can all work together to really center these issues, because again, they're overlapping, in our work that we've done previously with incarcerated pregnant people. What does it mean to have the necessary supports in place where you can have education, you can have someone to help you to advocate for yourself, to understand that just because I'm in this carceral system, I'm still a human being. What does it mean for someone who's on Medicaid to be treated the same way those with private insurance are treated? To see them uplifted in their care and to have the same levels of access to their health services and the things that they need. What does it mean for a pregnant person who maybe doesn't have equitable housing, but to not have to wait months, to the point where they are about to give birth, to be put into a family shelter if necessary, and then transferred to housing that is equitable? So really like looking at the ways in which we can center all of the things that have been mentioned: domestic workers, those who are undocumented, those who need to be making a living wage, those who are experiencing housing and food insecurity, really looking at that from a perspective of these are people who are just trying to live their everyday lives, and create and center joy and hope, in a positive way. And then you have all of these roadblocks that are coming into play. And so, as full spectrum doulas who offer abortion, pregnancy, childbirth, postpartum, miscarriage, stillbirth, all of those services, and thinking about how all of those different intersections come up, we just need to really work from a decolonized birth, and we call it decolonizing birth, place where we're breaking down these systems of oppression and thinking about ways in which how everyone is educated to support someone through every aspect of, their healthcare needs in a way that's affirming to them. And so it's really meeting people where they are, not where we expect them to be. And these institutions really taking accountability for the harm and the trauma that they cause when someone is seeking out reproductive health services. And no longer just being in communities, but what does it mean for them to be extensions of those communities and really get community stakeholders involved every step of the way as they go along.
Let's give it up to Chanel and to all of our panelists on chat. Just show them a little love, show them a little shout out, and to all of the panelists. Thank you for taking the labor and the time to educate us this evening. We are all experimenting towards a more equitable, more just, more anti-racist, more anti-ableist world. We can't do it without each other. Many people say these kind of community organizing and these things are touchy-feely. Well, people wouldn't try to stop us from doing it if it wasn't effective, right? If we need each other, and we're an ecosystem. And so all of you guys model that, and through your work, please put your websites in the chat so that people can learn more. To the audience members, all 69 of you who have stung with us, keep thinking about what a feminist recovery is. We can't do it without you either. And we have just a few closing remarks, and I promise to get everybody out of here by 8:30. We've got our controller, Brad Lander, who modeled what it was like to be an ally, and then our council members, and then we'll say goodnight. Brad.
I don't know how to properly express my gratitude or humility in the face of this panel. That really all was quite extraordinary. And even though there wasn't enough time for back and forth and Q&A, you built something together that simultaneously reflected the real lived pain of your members and the people you organized with, that showed how, of course, theoretically sophisticated you and they are. So organizing practically for real gains, building deep critical consciousness together, and then knitting this vision together of a city that doesn't just show up for them, but through demanding and centering care and collaboration and humanity. We'd just be lucky to live in that city. And we do live in that city because y'all are the leaders of it, and you're doing the organizing and the building of it. And what it takes for us to hear that and listen and demand it, sitting in the skin of, highly privileged white men in government and on the ground in the people that you're building with, is just really powerful. So I will just offer a few words from Adrienne Rich, because honestly, that's what you made me all think of tonight. What would it mean to live in a city whose people were changing each other's despair into hope? You yourself must change it. Though your life felt arduous, new and unmapped and strange, what would it mean to stand on the first page of The Edge of Despair? Thank you. I do want to shout out a few people who are in the background because they're not on screen tonight, but played a big role in making this event happen. So huge thank you to our team in the controller's office that does special events, Alia Latif and Nasra Garabala. And Elizabeth Montessori, and and then tomorrow we have this incredible policy report coming out that builds from a lot of the work you were all talking about, led by Allison Silkowski on our team and Steph Silkowski on Tiffany's team. And what a blessing it has been to get to organize together with and collaborate with them. I'll stop there so there's room for Tiffany and Shahana to close us out. But I guess I would just say Beverly and Chanel and Marisa and Pratana and Jimena and Antonine. I hope we get the opportunity to keep supporting and organizing together with you, because the work you're doing on the ground and with your members and with each other has enough power to transform the city with the vision of recovery that you have articulated tonight. And it will be a blessing to be in budget fights with you in between now and the end of June. It will be a blessing to try to heed your demands for procurement justice and make sure your contracts and your payments are delivered to you on time and with enough resources to pay your teams to do it. And it will be a blessing to continue organizing with you in the long run in the battle for the city, the vision of which you've laid out tonight. Thank you.
Oh, God, y'all, I am bursting with love right now, and it's energizing and it's hopeful, and I'm just deeply grateful. I want to double and triple down on all of the gratitude that Brad put into the space, and I also just want to add that coming from a space of really focusing on community safety and alternatives to policing, that Anthony and Beverly were just speaking my language. And said all of the things, but I want to close us pulling out a couple of things, specifically that patriarchal systems and capitalism inherently create these barriers to community safety, and also naming that Anthony was talking about, that shared discomfort with the word feminist a little bit, right? And immediately wanting to be like, whoa, we're not talking about more women CEOs so that, you know, the most powerful women are on par with the most powerful men. But what we're talking about is an intersectional feminism that also has like a very intentional analysis around capitalism that is about deconstructing hierarchies and flattening them altogether, right? And, you know, just having that inform our approach. I know it certainly informs my approach, saying that everything that we do is going to be about championing the hopes and the needs of the folks who are most marginalized and most exploited, right? Queer and trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary folks, Black, Indigenous, and other women and femmes of color, women and femmes of color of all immigration statuses, those who are incarcerated and institutionalized, those with disabilities, those who are performing sex work and other criminalized jobs. And, you know, all of that requires shifting resources from those patriarchal systems, right? Like policing and punishment, and to those systems of care and compassion, of support, housing, healthcare, childcare, workplace protections, all of the things that we talked about tonight, and using all the tools in our toolbox. And so I think about taking on this new role in city government and like, well, what does that mean? What does that mean from a legislative perspective? I mean, obviously we use all the tools in our toolbox, and we spent all day grilling, you know, agencies around, you know, for accountability and around budget items. But from a legislative perspective, I just want to let y'all know two things that we're doing right now. I'm going to be introducing at our next stated meeting 2 pieces of legislation that are designed to reduce barriers to access to support for survivors of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And one is a bill that would create a city maintained portal of resources so that people know exactly what organizations to turn to, what services they provide, and how to access them. And that remains maintained by the city. And then another is to create a survivor housing stability fund. And it's essentially a fund for emergency grants to cover costs and expenses for survivors of domestic violence, whether it's housing, moving costs, safety plan costs, medical bills, like you name it. And to bring it full circle and then pass it to Shahana is that fund came out of a comptroller's report from a few years ago. And it's one that Shahana championed after that report came out. So we got a lot of work to do, but I couldn't be prouder and happier and more grateful to be doing it with y'all. And I'll pass it to Shahana.
Thank you. Thank you, Jimena, Chanel, Beverly, Antonine, Prarthana, and Marissa. I am really just happy and hopeful and excited, and all the things I shared early on just about being energized. This feminist vision brought me to my work within the disability justice realm many, many years ago when I was diagnosed with lupus. And so this has been a lifelong project for me. When I think about democracy, it is absolutely tied to ensuring that we lead with feminist principles and values. I also want to give a shout out to Sadie for moderating so beautifully and moving us along and tying the threads together. And of course, to our teams for their behind the scenes work over the last couple of weeks. And this production of the report that is being released this week as well, because we didn't want this just to be a panel discussion. We want to make sure that that we're oriented around some policy visions, that there are some numbers, and there are numbers attached to what could be funded or what we need, especially in this season of the budget. Big shout out also to the interpreters. Thank you for ensuring that this work is available in Spanish, Bangla, and of course, so many other languages that are not here tonight, but language access is also a core part of how we ensure disability justice. I just really want to express my gratitude and just the deep honor I feel to be in the company of all of these leaders. Thank you for teaching me and showing us again what undoing extractive, exploitative, capitalist ways of surviving and safety means. You are doing this work every single day. This isn't a new vision that we're laying out. You've been laying this groundwork for years. Feminist movement building has always happened in our city, and to see the generative ways that it's shaping necessary discourses and especially particularly in this new council really excites me, and it is absolutely urgent that we're collaborating, we're experimenting together. I want to close by reminding our panelists and the audience, and I'm grateful to the audience that stuck around and all who came in and flowed in and out, that this feminist recovery is also one that prioritizes our joy. It is an investment in our happiness, that the visions we have laid out and are working towards and are building every single day is about our collective and radical happiness. We want New Yorkers to be happy. And so I want to center that happiness, that this is work we're committed to because we believe in the joy of every single New Yorker. We don't believe in abandonment. And so that should be what brings us here every single day. And that work also requires rest. Of course, I'm overjoyed listening to all the work we're all doing. But I really want to stress just how important rest is in our collective survival and our creative capacity to continue to do this work, and also good friendships. And so I encourage good fun in our work. I'm so happy that Antonine reminded me about the Combahee River Collective a couple years ago, a crew of us Bangladeshi feminists. Feels like almost a decade ago, we formed the Bangladeshi Feminist Collective. And so I'm just thinking about the nascent formations of all of these feminist movement spaces I belong to and how they've grown or dissolved, or the new ones that are emerging as I talk to so many young people in my district, forming after-school clubs around feminist values. We were inspired in part by the Combahee River Collective. And as folks know, they were a group of Black queer feminists and liberation fighters. And as a collective, we were really centered in thinking about women in our city who are marginalized in broader activist spaces, that not every activist spaces, social justice spaces, spaces that talk about inclusive democracies are open to everybody. And so we came together to document our thinking, our hopes, our scholarship, our dreams around building a feminist city. And this was many years ago. So I encourage folks to really do deep dives into the history of feminisms in our city, and especially the work that Black queer feminists have led for years. And so we walk in their legacy, and we must honor their work every single day. And so the Bangladeshi Feminist Collective was created thanks to the lessons taught by the Combahee River Collective. So anyways, welcome to the feminist movement we are building in New York City. Everyone is welcome to this table, and one where we as legislators take absolutely seriously and are committed to this approach of leading and governing. So thank you all for being here tonight. Really, really thrilled that this is how we're spending Wednesday. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And with that,